Philosophy of Religion Part 2. In this section of the presentation, we'll deal with two major topics, the attributes of God and rational proofs for the existence of God. As I mentioned in the previous part of this presentation, the term attributes here has three synonyms: qualities, predicates, and perfections. And you'll remember that Descartes uses mainly the term perfections. So these are descriptions of the qualities of God. So we've already dealt with, I think, probably the three omnis, as we can call them. Omniscience, let's just be reminded, though, of the definitions. Omniscience, again, omni means all. So in this case, it's all science, and science is knowledge. So omniscience is God is all-knowing. Omnipotence, again, omni is all, potence comes from potency, which means power, so God is all-powerful. Omnibenevolence, again, omni is all. Benevolence, actually from the Latin, means goodwill, so it's goodness, all good. God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all good. God is also said to be infinite. Infinity is a spatial term. It has to do with bigness. And therefore, in this sense, God is as big as it's possible to get. God has no limits, literally. Eternality is a kind of a butchered word. It is the quality of being eternal, but we don't really have a case for the word eternal like the term infinity. So eternality is kind of a butchered word, but it has to do with time. God is, at least in certain forms of Jewish and Christian and Islamic theology, God is eternal. Now that actually is a point of debate, especially, for example, in early Christianity, whether God, first off, whether God has a beginning. Second off, whether when God created there was something already there that God used to create with, or what the Christians finally decided on, the idea that God is eternal, has no beginning and no end. So that's what eternal means. Eternal is different, therefore, from everlasting and immortal. Both everlasting and immortal mean that it comes into being, has a birth in a sense, but then doesn't die. So those are different terms. Unity, the quality of not having any parts, and of course being, which is a contested attribute, as we'll talk about in a minute. One of the questions about these is how, if God is so transcendent, invisible, and different from us, how can we know anything about God at all? So the issue of the unknowability of God is of major importance. Some religions hold that God reveals God's self directly to human beings. Others, and some religions also might say that God reveals God's self through nature, through scriptures, through traditions, through sacraments, through a variety of things. So God makes God's self known in a variety of ways. Nevertheless, in an absolute sense, God is beyond anything knowable. We have knowledge, but God is God's knowledge. God's knowledge is so far beyond anything we can conceive of that we might not even recognize it as knowledge. God is so transcendent. God is good, but God is, in what sense is God good? And we might say, my dog is good, my donut is good, I'm having a good day, I feel good. That's four different senses of the word good. In what sense is God good? So in one sense, God is good. We can say God is good because to the extent that we understand what goodness is, God has that quality. But really, in an absolute way, God is beyond all forms of goodness that we can know. So we could say, yes, God is good. But in another sense, God is not good. Not in the sense of being evil, but in the sense of being beyond all forms of human predication, of the human ability to describe the qualities of God. One of the ways that Thomas Aquinas describes the otherness, the transcendence of God, is that he says, whereas human beings have attributes. For example, hair color is a contingent attribute. In other words, contingent meaning dependent. In other words, you can change it. It's not necessary. Contingent and necessary are opposite terms in philosophy. So a contingent attribute is one you have, doesn't have to be that way. And in fact, life is a contingent attribute for human beings, for example, or if you want to say being is a contingent attribute because there was a time when we weren't alive, and there will be a time when we're not alive anymore. Whereas God has being also, but God can't not have being. God's being is necessary. God doesn't just have being, God is being. God doesn't just have goodness, but is goodness, Aquinas says. I've mentioned before Feuerbach and Freud on the projection theory in the previous presentation, so I'll skip that. And we're going to skip Heidegger on ontotheology. It'll take us too far afield right now. Now we'll turn to the rational proofs for the existence of God. The cosmological, ontological, design, moral, and common sense arguments. I will give a couple of versions of each of these, and at the end, and then after presenting each one, I will also present some arguments against each one. I think it's safe to say that none of these arguments are absolutely logically slam dunk, shut the door kind of arguments that are going to convince everybody. And in fact, in the case of the cosmological and design argument, at least, they don't even, the arguments as they stand don't actually prove the existence of God. We'll get into that. But if you take these arguments and combine them, they're pretty suggestive. And at the end, we're going to look a little bit at an article by an author named Clayton, and he argues that one of the reasons that these rational proofs for the existence of God got a bad rap after Immanuel Kant sort of blew holes in the ontological argument. But one reason they got a bad rap is that Kant and others were really misunderstanding how they were used. So we'll get into that in a little bit, and then we'll wrap up with some comments on the, where does philosophy of religion need to go from here? We saw the cosmological argument in Descartes' Meditations, but here's a couple of other versions of it. In Plato's Laws, Book 10, he talks about, now usually the cosmological argument is argued in terms of cause and effect, but if you think about what cause and effect is, one of the things we're talking about is motion. Where does motion come from? How do things get put in motion? Well, as with the argument from cause and effect, every effect has a preceding cause, and every cause is the effect of a preceding cause. And you can follow that line back, and you either have to have cause and effect going to infinity, having no beginning, but just always, always being a chain of cause and effect, or you have to have a first cause that gives rise to all of the causes and effects after it. Same thing with motion. But the way Plato does this is a little tricky. He says there's two types of motion. The first type is motion that is caused by another thing, for example, a cue ball hitting an 8-ball on a billiard table. Then he says there's self-originating motion. Well, that's an intriguing idea. What kind of things create their own motion? Think about it. Plato says the only kind of being that has self-causing motion is soul, by which I think he means the sort of animating energy of all beings that move themselves. He concludes that all motion must be caused by soul. So the first principle of all things, that from which all things come to be, must be soul-like. But notice, as we'll also notice with the other cosmological arguments, that this doesn't actually prove the existence of God. It only proves, if anything, the existence of a first self-moved mover. And so what Plato has to do, and you'll see that the other arguments do this also, what Plato has to do in order to make this an argument into an argument for the existence of God is combine it with a design argument, and by which he's able to suggest that this soul must be perfectly wise and good because it brought about such rationality and order that we see in nature. So by combining those two, he can then say that that self-causing motion at the beginning of all motion, that is also perfectly wise and good. I mean, that really looks a lot like God at that point. But notice that the cosmological argument itself has this problem, that it stops at a first cause. And that's not good enough, because the first cause could be anything. It could be God, it could be a team of gods. It could be the Big Bang, a super hot, super dense singularity at the heart of the void that explodes one day for no reason. It could be a god and a goddess procreating. It could be a crack in the cosmic egg. The argument only tells us that it's the first principle of motion or of all things. But it doesn't tell us what the nature of the first principle is unless we do more work. Aristotle's argument is similar. He posits a self-moved mover, and then, as I say, he brings in other attributes other than being the first cause. This first cause, the self-moved mover, must be eternal, substance, actual, and it created everything through basically love. Well, that sounds an awful lot like God. But notice that the argument himself, the cosmological argument itself, only took him back to the self-moved mover. And then he had to import other arguments from outside the cosmological argument to make it work. So the main problem with the cosmological argument is that the first cause that is proved by the argument isn't necessarily God, and that it requires more work to prove that the first cause is actually God. And you can do that through combining it with the other arguments, as Plato and Aristotle did. And one other question that we might raise is, why is an infinity of causes irrational? Why can't there be an infinity of causes? Now, the Greeks would have had a very simple explanation for that. There can't be an infinity of causes because that's irrational, because infinity is irrational. It's not a rational concept. You can't actually capture infinity in a concept. Any concept of infinity you might get, you could just add one and then you're off to the races. You're never going to conceptualize infinity. So for the Greeks, that would have been enough of an answer. But there have been schools throughout history that brought up this idea every once in a while. But notice that modern science too agrees with the ancient philosophers and agrees with the monotheistic religions that there is a first cause. The dominant theory today in astrophysics is that the beginning of all things was that super hot, super dense singularity at the heart of the void that explodes one day for no reason, the Big Bang. That's a first cause. It's not a divine first cause, presumably. Who knows? But it is so this argument would prove, if it proves anything, it would prove something like that, as well as it would prove the existence of God. But science agrees that the infinity of causes is perhaps not rational. On the other hand, of course, one of the challengers of that dominant theory in astrophysics is multiverse theory, in which case all of that goes out the window. We've also seen the ontological argument, Descartes' version of the ontological argument, which we'll get to here in a minute. But we haven't seen Anselm's, which is probably one of the influences on Descartes. St. Anselm of Canterbury was a great Roman Catholic churchman, and in his Proslogion, which was a devotional book for his monks, he was the abbot of a monastery, the head of a monastery, and he wrote this book as a devotional work for his monks. We'll get back to that. Keep that in mind, though. And so in the course of that devotional book, he presents this argument. First off, he makes the claim that everybody has an idea of God. Even people who would say that they don't have an idea of God have at least some, or for example, the atheist must have some idea of what God is in order to know what they're rejecting. And so Anselm thinks that there is a sort of a basic idea of God that anybody who can speak the word God meaningfully would share. They would share that meaning. And Anselm thinks that meaning is that God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. That than which nothing greater can be conceived. In other words, think of the greatest thing possible, the thing with the most perfections, as Descartes would say. If you think of that, but then you add another perfection, well, then that second thought is God, not the first one. I'll put it another way. Let's say you're on a game show, and behind curtain one is a God who has omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, infinity, and eternity. Behind door number 2 is a God that has all of those attributes and being. Which is the greater? Obviously, the greater God is the God behind door number 2. So God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. In other words, a being with all of the perfections. And just as I did in the sort of game show scenario, Anselm asks the question: is it greater for God to exist as an idea, or both as an idea and in reality? In other words, is it greater for God to exist as omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, infinite, and eternal, or as all of those things plus being? Well, if you answered plus being, then God exists because God has being. That's the argument. Now, we'll see Descartes is much simpler than this. As we saw when we talked about Descartes, Descartes actually gives us 2 versions of the ontological argument. The first one is based on something like St. Anselm's. God is a being with all perfections: omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, infinity, eternity, and being. Well, he says being is a perfection, therefore God exists. A very short, simple version of St. Anselm's argument. Descartes also gives us the argument from really you can use any one of the attributes, but he picks infinity. And he asks himself the question, based on the idea that things with more reality give rise to things with less reality, not the other way around. Where could a person like me get the idea of infinity? Because I don't have enough reality to produce that idea. Only an actually existing infinite being would have enough reality to produce that idea in me. And as I say, you don't have to pick infinity. You could, according to the way this argument works, you could use any of the attributes and it would prove the same thing. The first objection to the ontological argument came from one of Anselm's own monks, Gonalo of Marmoutier. And Gonalo charged that by the same argument, he could prove the existence of a perfect island. Because if you can think of a perfect island, then because it has all perfections, it must exist. And Anselm responds by distinguishing between contingent and necessary attributes. We mentioned this I think it was either in this slide presentation or the last one. We talked about Thomas Aquinas's distinction of contingent and necessary attributes. Same thing here. Basically, contingent attributes are those that a thing can have or not and still be the same thing. So you can have blue hair or green hair and you're still the same being. Necessary attributes are attributes you have to have in order to, or a thing has to have in order to be that thing. God, the perfect island, Anselm says, has being, but it's a contingent attribute. In other words, the island, like a human being, comes into being and passes away and changes over time. Whereas God's being is necessary to God. You can have the idea of an island without being. In other words, it's a non-existent island. It hasn't come into being, or it passed away, or whatever. But you can't. It is contradictory to have the idea of a non-existent God. The idea of God, you could say, contains the idea of being. Now, Kant came along much later. Anselm and Gonalo are in the 11th century, and Kant is in the 18th. But Kant takes that argument and again takes it out of context, which we'll get to that in a minute. And that context was the devotional work that Anselm had written. Kant just ignores the devotional nature of the context, and he just takes it as a logical argument. And Kant argues that existence or being is not a predicate. So when you make the list, the 3 omnis, infinity, and eternity, and you add being, by adding being, you haven't changed the list at all. and being doesn't alter something in that way when it's spoken or thought. I mean, it's kind of like if I went, met somebody on the street and said, "Hi, my name is Mark, and I exist." Well, by the virtue of the fact that they met me, they knew that I existed. That was redundant to say so. And in the case of the list of God's qualities, the three omnis, infinity, eternity, when you add being, you haven't added anything, Kant says. And to all intents and purposes, the ontological argument was dead for about 150 years after Kant. He pretty well killed it off. It has been revived, and there are people who are working on presenting more logically consistent versions of it. The design argument is based on an analogy between human design and cosmic design. Anything created by a human being, anything that shows, craft, I guess you could say, must have had a human designer. And by analogy, since there is order and regularity in nature, therefore that order and regularity must have had a designer, a cosmic designer. So it's a comparison, an analogy between human design and cosmic design. One version of this, it's historically very important, is William Paley's idea of God as the great watchmaker. God creates the world like a fine watch, winds it up, and then leaves it alone. And this image of God as the great watchmaker is really the basis of many forms of what is known as deism, which is rational religion. Very interesting that most of the founding fathers of America were deists in one way or another. The most obvious example perhaps being Thomas Jefferson, who actually took the Christian Bible and made his own version by taking out all of the supernatural stuff, all the miracles and things like that, which he thought were irrational. Again, because he had this kind of rationalistic idea of God. God is the sort of great designer in the sky, if you will. Intelligent design is an attempt by those who support creationism to make creationism more scientific and try to get around the ban on the teaching of creationism that was put in place by the Supreme Court back in the 1950s. Intelligent design has been taken before the Supreme Court and they rejected it. They said it was just another form of creationism. But intelligent design is based on the traditional design argument that we've been talking about. However, it has not been able to prove that it was scientific, and it deserves consideration alongside scientific theories. The objections to the design argument come from David Hume. And typical of David Hume, he doesn't give one or two really good arguments and really argue for them. Instead, he just takes a handful of arguments, throws them at the wall, and sees what sticks. But these are pretty interesting arguments. First off, he simply says that the analogy between human design and cosmic design is a bad analogy. Now, an analogy is a comparison of two things. So a good comparison is between things that are similar, and a bad comparison is between things that are dissimilar. If I cut my finger, I bleed red blood, and you know this because you're human and you've probably done it, or you've seen it happen to somebody, and therefore you know it's a good comparison because we're all humans and that happens to us. However, if your cat gets a paper cut, the comparison is a little bit weaker. We figure it's going to be red blood because we know most mammals have red blood, etc., etc. But the cat is different enough from us that the analogy is weaker. If then I go and I give a paper cut to a tree, well, I'm not gonna get blood. I might get liquid, I might get sap, but I'm not going to get blood. So that's a much weaker analogy. And then if I try to give a paper cut to a rock, they take me to the loony bin, right? So, that's the difference between good and bad analogy. It's simply the strength of the comparison. And Hume says you can't compare human design to cosmic design for a variety of reasons. For one thing, the type of causation, the type of cause and effect that goes into a human designing something is one kind of design. The universe could be, full of all kinds of different types of causation. some of which, Hume says we might not know. And he was right, because, they didn't know anything at all about, some of the subatomic properties and those kinds of things. So he says it's based on a bad analogy. And it's, another reason it's based on a bad analogy is simply scale. We are, in regard to the order in the universe, or to the design in the universe, in regard to the design in the universe, we are like peasants trying to read the Aeneid. And what he means by that is illiterates trying to read one of the great works of literature, Virgil's Aeneid. In other words, we understand diddly squat about the universe, is what he's saying. Then he does an interesting ploy, which is kind of a reductio ad absurdum. Again, in a reductio, what you do is you take your opponent's argument and you show it has one absurd consequence. Well, he shows it has three absurd consequences. He says, okay, let's say that the design in creation proves that there's a designer. On the basis of an analogy with human design, why would we assume that this is the universe that God intended to design? After all, most human designers go through trial and error to produce their final product. Artists produce sketch after sketch after sketch before they produce a final painting. Could it not be that this universe that we find ourselves in is not the one that God intended at all, but is just a trial run for a better one? I mean, based on the analogy, you could come to that absurd conclusion. Based on this analogy between human design and cosmic design, you could also come to the absurd conclusion, not that there's a single designer, but that there's a team of creators. After all, most human creations, most human designs, like buildings, are not the product of one person, but of a team. Why wouldn't that be the case for the cosmic designer or designers? And Hume says, actually, if what you want to find is a sort of model for cosmic design based on the human experience of design, why not procreation? That creates design. Parents don't give rise to human parents don't give rise to baboons. Well, all right, there might be exceptions, but human parents don't generally give rise to baboons because there is obviously a design involved. And, this is Hume talking before anybody knew anything about genetics, so I think that's kind of insightful. And finally, he just says, isn't the if design is a proof of that there's a designer, what is the lack of design proof of? Which is kind of a disturbing question. We turn now to the moral argument, and we begin with Blaise Pascal's famous wager. Pascal, first off, was a great scientist and mathematician in his youth. As you can see, he didn't live very long, so he didn't have a very long life, but he was really a prodigy in the sciences. And he had a religious conversion in his 20s. And the result of that was a book called Pensées, which I really recommend to you. It's P-E-N-S, E with an accent, E-S. P-E-N-S-E-E-S. Means thoughts, musings, meditations. And, he's the guy who said things like, the heart has reasons of which reason knows nothing. Just brilliant insights. And his wager was not intended really as an argument for the existence of God as much as to try to convince people who were rationalists, who had maybe lost their faith or were skeptical, that having faith, there was a rational basis for having the faith. And so what he said is, if you're a betting person, then what are the odds that you come out ahead on the basis of either believing in God or not believing in God? So let's say you don't believe in God. You don't believe in God and God exists, then you're going to go to hell. If you don't believe in God and God does not exist, nothing will happen. You live your life, no difference. On the other hand, if you believe in God and God does not exist, nothing will happen, though your belief in God may have contributed meaning to your life in some way. But if you believe in God and God exists, then you've hit the jackpot. So a betting person, a rational person in other words, would obviously believe in God, Pascal says. Kant's moral argument comes out of his epistemology, which we studied earlier. So if you'll remember, Kant is the one who says that we get sense intuition from the world, but sense intuition is not knowledge by itself. Then consciousness has structures, the a priori structures of consciousness, such as space and time and the categories. And these are not knowledge either because they're empty. And so you can only have knowledge if the sense intuition sort of fills the categories of consciousness. You have to have both sense intuition and the structures of consciousness to have knowledge. But Kant says there are ideas that have no sensory intuition. In other words, we can think things of which we can have no sensory experience. And these are metaphysical ideas. And Kant says the metaphysical ideas are not knowledge. Now that's quite a wild claim, because for Aristotle, metaphysics was the first of the sciences. It was the most important science, the most basic. And really the whole Christian tradition also believed in that metaphysics was really the highest part of philosophy. And here comes Kant and says, no, metaphysics isn't even knowledge. But Kant says there are three metaphysical ideas that we need to keep in order to make ethics work, or in order to have a rational morality. And a rational morality is one in which good people are rewarded consistently and evil people are punished consistently. But Kant points out, we know that in this life that doesn't work out. There is no ultimately rational or consistent morality in this life, because in this life some good people are punished and some evil people are rewarded. So Kant says we have to have these three concepts, and they're called the postulates of practical reason. The postulates of practical reason. Postulate meaning he just puts them out there, he poses them. Practical reason meaning ethics. So for the sake of ethics, he's going to put out there, he's going to suggest these three metaphysical ideas. The first is freedom. Freedom is metaphysical, meaning you can't have a sensory experience of freedom. You can't shake hands with freedom. You can't say howdy to freedom. It's an idea based on other ideas. It is a metaphysical idea. Why do we need freedom for ethics? Because without freedom, you can't have any ethics. Because without freedom, you don't have a moral agent, or you don't have moral agency. Moral agency is where a person can be praised for doing something good or blamed for doing something bad. And if a person isn't free, then they can't fully be praised for doing something good or blamed for doing something bad. So they're not an agent. They're not a responsible moral agent. And so you have to have freedom just in order to have ethics at all, to have moral agency. Second, the second postulate of practical reason is the afterlife, because as I just mentioned, in this life, ethics is very often not consistent. Good people are not always rewarded, and evil people are not always punished. So we need an afterlife in which good people can be rewarded and evil people can be punished. And, of course, we need the idea of God, because who's going to do the rewarding and punishing but God? And so Kant comes to the idea of God by way of ethics, or by way of this use of the postulates of practical reason, which are moral concepts. James is a pretty utterly different thing. Of course, James is the great American pragmatist philosopher, one of the inventors of pragmatic philosophy, or pragmatism. I highly recommend his works. The Varieties of Religious Experience is a fascinating work. His book, Pragmatism, both of those are collections of lectures, and they're incredibly readable. And it's such a joy to read James because the language is very American, I think. And so I highly recommend him to you. His later books, like Radical Empiricism, are also fantastic. But I think one thing about James is he always struggled with religion. He grew up in a religious household, although a very peculiar religious household. His father was a Swedenborgian, a follower of August Swedenborg, who was a 19th century prophet kind of a guy. And William James' father's close friends were people like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and the Algonquin Circle, the Transcendentalists, the great, American religious spiritual philosophical movement of the mid to late 19th century, including people like Walt Whitman and Louisa May Alcott as well. So that's the atmosphere in which James grew up. And I think he always wanted to be religious, but he never found his way into religion. The best he could do is study other people's religion, and to that end, he kept up a correspondence with hundreds of people and asked them to send to him their religious experiences. And there's many of those accounts contained in his lectures on the varieties of religious experience. For James, as a pragmatist, whether a concept is true or false is not a matter of its essence. It's not a matter of getting to its essence as it would be for Plato, for example. Rather, whether something is true or false is whether it works or not. A concept is true to the extent that it works. If it ceases to work, if it ceases to be beneficial, then it is false to that degree. And James consistently applies this to the concept of God, even though he himself, I don't think, could speak or testify to belief in God. He is consistent enough in his principles to say the basic idea of pragmatism, that a concept is true depending on whether or not it works, should also be applied to God. The concept of God, if the concept of God motivates and supports moral striving, therefore it's morally useful, pragmatically useful, therefore it should be kept. But if at any point one's belief in God ceases to motivate and support moral reasoning, then one would be in the right to discard that belief. Now, we'll see some objections to the moral argument in the next slide. One argument that is often made in support of religion is that without religion, there would be no supernatural sanction for morality. What this means is there would be sort of no divine backup to human morality. And at the human level, of course, morality is relative. It's relative to time and place, different cultures and different times and places. And so the only way to have a morality for all human beings would be to have a divine transcendent being who could lay down the law, as it were. Now, other people are going to argue that we don't need that kind of supernatural grounding for morality, and that we can explain where morality comes from or why morality is necessary without reference to a divine being. For example, survival of the fittest obviously will produce a certain level of morality. For example, animal communities in which they eat their young are going to die out because they're not, selected for in evolutionary terms. So this is one of the debates over the moral argument. And I say here, is Kant's hypothetical God really God? We really could say that of all the moral arguments, I think. Is a God that is the object of a wager, is that really God? Well, to be fair to Pascal, he wasn't trying to prove the existence of God. He was just trying to bring his more rationalistic friends, perhaps kicking and screaming, to recognize that there was a rational reason to believe in God. Is Kant's God really God? Well, there again, it's a postulate, and a postulate is certainly not the thing as belief or faith. I think we could say the same thing about James, that he wanted to believe in God, but he was not able to really testify to a belief. But he left the door open, and I think that's very interesting about James, is that he left the door open, he left that question open. I think he really had the hope that someday he might cross through it too. The common sense argument in its basic form is pretty common sense. People in all times and all places have had religions, therefore it makes sense to believe in religion because most people have done it. And I think the objections to that are obvious. We'll get to those in a second. There is a more complex version of this argument associated with folks like Père Teilhard de Chardin, Chardin's an interesting guy, probably has one of the most unusual job descriptions ever. He was a French Roman Catholic priest and a biological evolutionist. So, yeah, those two things don't usually go together. And if they do go together, usually the priest isn't a priest for very long, but he managed to stay in the church despite the fact that the church did not endorse his teachings. Um, According to Chardin, all of the universe is evolving, and so far the highest stage that it has achieved is human consciousness. But human consciousness is only one stage in the path of evolution, and human consciousness itself is evolving to what Chardin called an omega point, the point at which human consciousness would be united to God in some way. He is not the only one to argue like this. Sri Aurobindo, Sri is S-R-I with a dot under the I, so it's pronounced with an SH, and it just means it's like an honorific. It is like sir or master. Sri Aurobindo, 20th century Hindu, worked out, he says, 40 or 50 different levels of consciousness. Now, keep in mind, most of us live on less than 10 levels of consciousness. So if there are 40, 50, or 50, those are getting, that would suggest that there is some room for evolution, let's say. Of course, the obvious objection to the basic common sense argument for the existence of God is the fact that most people in most times and places have believed in God is not really a very good reason for believing in God, since humans have believed all kinds of superstitious nonsense. The earth is flat, etc., etc. So that argument is not a very strong argument at all, although, I suppose it has a little bit of weight. Second question would be evidence of evolution toward consciousness. In terms of the more complex version of the common sense argument that basically, God is part of is a stage, the final stage in the evolution of consciousness. Is there evidence of that? And actually, I just saw recently that there are people that are talking in this way. I will say that I think there is some of the literature that talks about the consciousness as evolving or consciousness as part of the evolutionary process is kind of flaky, but it seems like there is some new science on this, so it might be worth checking out, but that's all I can say about it right now. John Clayton gives us a defense of the arguments for the existence of God against attacks on it by people like Kant. He says that they Kant especially, took the arguments out of context. As I mentioned when we were looking at Anselm's argument, he uses the argument in the midst of a devotional work, a book that is intended for people who already believe in God. Anselm doesn't need to prove the existence of God to his monks, and that's not what he's doing. But what he's doing is backing up his, the prayers and the exhortations to faith that he's giving his monks. He's backing that up with reason. After all, in order to convince them, or to help, I should say, to help them in their belief, he can use prayer. He can use a lot of rhetoric. He can use a lot of Bible passages. He can use a lot of emotion, but he could also use reason, and that's what he does. And Clayton makes this interesting claim that I think is a very important claim in the study of anything historical. And that is, if we do not understand the role of the arguments, it's not because we don't think as they did. It's because we don't do the same things that they did. We don't live in their books the way that they lived in their books. And this idea of lectio divina, the idea of a meditative type of reading that they would have done, the ontological argument and actually the cosmological argument in another writing of Anselm's would have been just part of that meditation. And that would have been the context for it. Now, this could have a variety of purposes, Clayton says. So the arguments for the existence of God could act in any of these ways. Apologetics doesn't have to do with saying I'm sorry. Apologetic comes from a Greek word, apologia, which means to defend something. So an apologetic is a defense of a set of beliefs to people who don't believe in those beliefs. So that's one use of the arguments for the existence of God. Polemical, to convince people within the community who are disagreeing in one way or another. Could have hermeneutic uses in the aiding in the interpretation of sacred texts. It could have edificatory or educational uses to build, and this I think was the primary usage of Anselm's proslogion, that is to exhort and to build up the belief, the faith of the members of the community, and to act as an aid to devotion. It's notable that Anselm's book begins with prayer, ends with prayer, and has prayer all the way through it. This is not a logic text. And what Kant does is he takes the argument out of that context, out of the devotional context, and treats it as if it's a standalone logical argument. And that really is, it makes it into a straw man. It makes it very easy to defeat the argument when you don't recognize its context. So just a quick word to conclude this presentation about newer topics for the philosophy of religion. First off, most of the issues would have to do with religious diversity, just bringing in consideration of more different religions and being open to the diversity of religions. Also, an area that is more and more important is religiously informed moral questions, as we have a lot of debates over various aspects of these life issues: war, capital punishment, euthanasia, abortion. Now, these are ancient topics, but they never really were in the textbooks of philosophy of religion. And of course, our thinking about them today is very different than in times past, and that needs to be taken into consideration. Another area that could be included is religiously informed social movements. And so here's a list of some on the left and some on the right. Social gospel was actually a liberal Protestant Christian movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Evangelicalism and fundamentalism are both Protestant Christian movements, conservative movements, traditionalist movements in America, and actually elsewhere as well. Tolstoy and anarchism. Leo Tolstoy was a Christian anarchist and tried to get a movement going there. Dorothy Day and the Catholic Workers Movement was a liberal, was really a social program, and Dorothy Day was a very outspoken progressive in her time. Liberation theology, which also includes black theology, the writings of people who are undergoing oppression and looking for liberation, political and social forms of liberation, and what the relationship is between those kinds of theories, social and political theory, and theology and religion. And, the moral majority, for example, is one of these movements as well. Conservative movement that tried to influence American democracy and had a pretty profound effect. Another issue, of course, would be new religions and getting further into the distinction of cults and religions. So a lot of areas for philosophy of religion to get into in the future.